Hello again, everybody. This is Paul Sims speaking to you from London. I'm the chairman at Pharma, and welcome. Welcome to today's webinar, which is called, as you can hopefully see in front of you, the Next Generation PSP. And it's proven to be a very popular webinar, despite the fact that we are still just about in August. We've had close to 800 people signed up. Well, thank you so much for being here, being on time, and I'm really looking forward to having a great conversation. So what was our motivation for this topic? I'll just say a quick word about that. Well, I suppose in conversations with various executives, it became very clear that traditional PSPs with a focus on the branded medicine, with interaction at very predetermined points, with only really a great basic sort of grasp and use of technology, they are frankly struggling to meet patients' true needs, and they're simply not good enough anymore. There is, of course, the ability to do much, much better. So this is a webinar about how to bring a next generation, a newer generation of PSPs to us more quickly and more defiantly. We're going to be talking about how to integrate patient input systematically into program development to avoid designing from the medicine's point of view. We're going to review the efforts to incorporate patient experience into value decisions and establish what actually works. We're going to look at how analytics can enable us to increase the number of data inputs beyond sort of basic PROs and surveys. So we can look at sensors, devices, other sources, and of course the various possibilities that technology now brings. We also have ambitions today to talk about the future, really. Digital therapeutics are already with us. Behavioral science is being incorporated into a lot of programs nowadays, but what's the best way of doing that? And really talking about the practicalities of creating that seamless and comprehensive data flow from the patient and into the future design of healthcare and what we offer as pharma companies. We could even talk about whether or not you should own your own PSP at all, or whether it should lie with the health system, with third parties, with tech companies, or with even consortia of pharma companies working together. So if you look at your screen now, you will see that I'm going to show you who's going to be talking today. Jim Donahue is on the left of your screen there. He's the president at S3 Connected Health. Has around 30 years experience in designing and delivering innovative services and solutions across healthcare, but also in the consumer and communications sectors. And I have to say, Jim and S3 have helped us put together today's session and have been marvelous in getting everything organized, getting you here, getting the theme of the event sorted. So really pleased that Jim's here. He's, by the way, now focused very much on the future of integrated patient services and solutions and the move towards value-based care. He's also designed the largest telehealth program in the UK and the largest chronic disease management program in Europe. So really useful experience that he's bringing with us today. Next to him is Sander. Sander is from Novartis, speaking to us from Basel today. He's been with Novartis around 5.5 years, was previously did nearly 9 years at Wyeth, now Pfizer, of course. Today, he's the worldwide head of digital solutions within immunology, hepatology, and dermatology. His mission is to create stronger customer communities, drive innovation within support and service programs, which of course is today's theme, and of course improving customer and patient engagement. So absolutely perfect for today's session. Next to him is Doug. Doug from UCB has been with the company for 2.5 years, whereas head of the patient experience and value mission, he describes his aim to enable patients to take control of their situation, as well as establishing UCB as a trusted source that extends way beyond prescription bottles and blister packs. So in practice, that means identifying and developing solutions that will enable patients living with chronic neurological disorders to live their ideal life, mobilizing networks and supersede individual brands. Again, things that we're going to be talking about today. So that's great. And last but certainly not least is Daria. Daria is the Director of eHealth and Connectivity for combination devices and products at Shire, which is obviously a really interesting area. Speaking to us from Boston, Daria actually studied aerospace engineering before being kind enough to lend his skills in the devices field. He's actually got a number of very interesting projects under his belt. He's worked on auto-injectors, wearable patches, infusion pumps, reconstitution kits, airway systems, implants of various different descriptions at Medtronic, Abbott, Amgen, and Novo Nordisk, and of course now Shire. So he's become a real expert in this combination product device area, and I think it's fantastic that you can join us today, Daria, as well. So a really great panel, and I'm pretty sure that you're sick of hearing from me now already. So what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm actually going to hand over to Jim, who's going to show us a few slides. But just before I do, can I ask everybody to take a look at the right-hand side of their screen? You should be able to see a box called questions, and I want to check that you're A, not asleep, and B, able to use that by just quickly writing hello into that box for me if you can. So there we go, I can see some nice hellos coming in. Lovely to have you here. Now, if there's anything that you particularly want to know, want to hear about during the course of the next hour, do write it in now. And please do keep this box open and active throughout, as obviously it's the only way to make sure that your exact questions are answered. And really, we want to make this into a discussion-based session rather than just a didactic session. So do please write in. Okay, let me hand over to Jim at this stage. Jim's going to show us a few things, and I'm going to switch the screen to his. Oh, change presenter. Sorry, I'm just multitasking at the moment. So there we go. Lovely. Okay, Jim, can you hear me?
I can, Paul.
Fantastic. Well, we can hear you too, and we can see your screen as well. So over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. So look, very happy to share a few initial thoughts just to set the scene in terms of the discussion. We'll just take a few minutes to do that. So let's start by where we are today. So I guess we're all familiar with today's patient support services, and how would you characterize them? Well, they're typically provided by nurses through nurse call centers or maybe visiting nurses. They're typically medicine focused. So for me, that means that they're really focused on ensuring that patients can get access to medication, that they get the logistical support in terms of receiving the medication, and that they can get some clinical support when they need to take it. The services, I would say, are often fragmented. They're sometimes delivered by different organizations in different countries just for practical reasons. And they can be expensive to run. And I would say they're characterized also by tending to provide relatively standard services to every patient, same type of services to every patient. They do use low-tech digital, but typically, again, it's fairly simple apps, reminders, and they don't typically try to incorporate real-time data from patients to try and understand what's happening with that individual patient. So the question is, what does the next generation of PSP look like? And I think what really is going to drive this is the explosion that's happening in terms of digital health technology in the world today. And we're all familiar with the range of things that are happening around connected devices and sensors, whether they be from continuous glucose monitors from companies like Medtronic, to implanted sensors around things like heart failure, to even devices that might detect stress levels. So there's a lot of new sensors and devices that can provide information. There's also a new breed of digital therapeutic that's coming into existence that can deliver clinical interventions that are proven to improve patient outcomes in areas like depression and cognitive decline. There's digital medicine type solutions from companies like Proteus, where there's a sensor and a pill integrated together. There's clinical decision support solutions that help patients and clinicians make good clinical decisions, and sometimes that's aided by data analytics. So there's a huge amount of new technology possibilities. But one of the items on the list here is around behavioral science. I think that's particularly important. And I think there's a growing understanding in the industry that behavioral science has a really big part to play in how we deliver next generation services. I'd say we now understand better than we did before that, as Dan O'Reilly, a famous behavioral economist, puts it, that we're all predictably irrational. So we act in ways that are often not in our best interest. Even though we know what's the right thing to do, we often do the thing that maybe is easier or is more familiar, or just that we feel provides us with more immediate value. And a lot of, I think, what can happen, technology is great, but I think really understanding patients and understanding what kind of behavioral techniques we can incorporate into that technology that will help patients look after themselves better and make better decisions is a key part of these future generation of PSPs. So what will they look like, and what will the characteristics of a new kind of advanced PSP look like? Well, I think one of the key things is that it will be providing more holistic care and support for patients. So again, we're coming from an era today where a lot of the patient support services are quite medicine-based. They're around the therapy. But actually, when you think about patients and the challenges they have, they're often far, far beyond the specific therapy that they're taking, or even beyond the specific condition. If you look at, say, for a group of RA patients, for example, and you look at why they might end up in an emergency department, it turns out that actually it's only in about 20% of cases that they would actually end up in an emergency department for something to do with their primary condition with RA. And actually 40% of the time, twice as much, they'll end up in the emergency department for something to do with a comorbidity that they have. So it's clear to me that actually looking after and just focusing on the therapy or even the specific condition that a patient has really isn't enough, because what patients want is to be able to live better quality of lives and in the most holistic way possible. So first thing that's going to happen is I think that these services are going to be more holistic. Second thing is that, again, PSP services today tend to be very siloed. They provide a specific service. The data from that service maybe doesn't go anywhere else. It doesn't contribute to the care of the patient. And really what's going to happen is as the data becomes richer from these services and as the services that are provided become richer, it'll make perfect sense to start to integrate these services more into the care pathway. And as we do, then the data from these services will become more available to care teams, and it will become part of the care delivery. And if you think about digital therapeutics being integrated into those care pathways and maybe delivered or prescribed or referenced via patient support services, then really these services can become part of how we deliver care. And then the third piece is really the underpinning piece, which is that these services will be informed by real world data. So if we can get data to really understand the person and really understand the individual and the challenges that they're having and the clinical challenges that they're having and the behavioral challenges that they're having, and then we can really use that data to have better interventions, better interactions with patients so that we can really deliver data-driven care. So that's kind of three of the fundamental pillars. And if we go one step further and imagine a little bit further and we think about what might be the future in terms of real personalized predictive and preventative care. So again, if you look at what's happening today, there's some fantastic devices that are being created, and there's some fantastic sensors that are being created. And if you look at examples like IBM Medtronic using data from continuous glucose monitors that can then be fed into a cognitive engine like IBM Watson and can be used to predict hypoglycemic events or the risk of hypoglycemic events for a patient. And imagine the power, if you're a diabetic patient, of actually receiving an intervention that would give you a warning or at least inform you about your risk level around having an event and maybe give you some advice about what you could do around that. Same for areas like COPD. It's a disease where patients, typically elderly, often end up frequently in hospital, and it's just very hard to predict when the exacerbations that they have will take place. Imagine if we were able to gather data, interact with patients, predict those exacerbations, and then intervene before those problems became really serious and they ended up in hospital. Same if you think about epileptic patients. So I think the potential here for the combination of getting clinical data from patients via maybe sensors, devices, getting patient data, understanding the challenges that they're having, combining that with data analytics on the population level data to really provide, actionable insights that are looking at the patient and really looking at that individual patient and then coming up with these actionable interventions that can really help and improve their life and the management of their condition. So that really, I think, is the rich future potentially ahead of us. So if I was to summarize it and just thinking about next generation PSPs, what will they look like? They'll be personalized. They'll be continuous. So the care will be more continuous. They'll be data-driven, so they won't be just based on, what are very valuable conversations that often happen between a nurse in a clinical call center and a patient, which is based on intuition and a one-to-one understanding of what the patient's going through. They're valuable things, but if we can supplement that and have that underpinned by data, that would be hugely important. The services will be behavioral. In the future, they're going to be predictive, and they'll be integrated into care pathways. And then the question is, what does it mean for pharma? So at a very basic level, it means the generation of rich real-world data and insights based on that. The second thing is, and it's obviously a key thing, and it's very close to my heart because we're involved in a lot of these types of programs, it provides support for value-based care. If you really understand the value that you're delivering to the patient and how that's impacting outcomes, then that can support things like outcome-based contracts. The third element, I think, is we mentioned earlier that often today's services are quite fragmented. And that means that there's a lack of uniformity, and different patients will get different services depending on where they are in the world and what condition they have. I think using some of these technologies, we can provide a more standard base of care, and patient services can be scaled more cost effectively. And that leads on to the next point, which means that a lot of patient services which are focused now around specialty conditions with high cost medications, that will be possible to broaden that out to other conditions, more general medicine conditions, and provide those services more broadly. And then finally, I think if we can deliver that value to patients and we can demonstrate that to payers and we can get clinicians bought into the value of those services, then it's really a win-win-win for everybody. And I think patients will buy into those services as well. So Paul, over to you. That's just a quick scene setter from me.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that, Jim, and a very nice introduction. So does anybody have anything to say, anything to add, any of our panelists, before I let the audience come in and say a few things?
Yeah, hi, this is Sander. I think, first of all, I agree with all of the things that were shown. I think those are really important changes that will take place. I think another thing, if you think from the patient perspective, I think the best patient support programs will actually learn to fade to the background when they're not needed. And I think that'll actually lead to a lot of satisfaction with people who are in those programs. Because nowadays we still often assume that patients are sort of welcomed into a wonderful new world of patient support, but in many cases we know that they don't want to constantly be engaged with their disease. So I think the ability to learn when to back off and when to step in, and that learning ability will be a key change that we need to try and create as well.
Yeah, I think, Sandra, building on that as well, I think the challenge for us moving forward is how as an industry we currently think about the patient, but how do we begin to think like the patient? So it's not the fact that we can continue to develop these new PSPs, but are we developing them that are addressing the challenges that our patients are experiencing and meeting their demands, but also thinking about it from their perspective versus just putting a whole bunch of different programs into that environment and actually in some cases making it more, enhancing the difficulty or increasing the difficulty with which the patient is able to navigate our systems today.
And that is especially true for patients who are dealing with multiple diseases. They may be dealing with medications from completely different companies with potentially very different types of patient support programs. So we need to figure out how to bridge those challenges as well.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, Jim mentioned it as well with respect to the PSPs being siloed, but recognizing they need to be integrated into the care pathway. So if we identify that we have an aging population that more than likely will be comorbid, they're facing more than just the disease state that we're trafficking in, how are we ensuring that we're not just creating another silo that's going to require them to rethink how they live their life, but plugging into the way they're currently living their life and making it so it blends into their healthcare and is not a standalone solution?
Okay, thanks to those people in the audience. Sorry, thanks to those people in the audience who've already been sending in their questions. We'll come to them very shortly. Rather than have the conversation carry on right now, what I'd like to really do is just to bring the audience in, if that's okay. I want to see where everybody actually is on the spectrum, whether or not you're doing the things that Jim is talking about already. So if you look at your screen right now, you should see a question appear onto it. Is your company creating next generation patient services beyond the scope of today's PSPs? So maybe you can select one of these following. Either yes, we're investing very heavily in a new generation. In other words, you consider yourself to be at the advanced level and absolutely doing a lot of the things that Jim's just talked about. Maybe the answer is sort of. There are sort of sporadic investments of this time, maybe isolated individuals or disease areas within your company that are actually getting these kind of investments, but down to sort of a motivated individual or department. No, but we're planning to. Our intentions are good. We just haven't got on with it yet. We're involved. No, we're just making incremental improvements to existing PSPs and other similar programs. And then finally, no, we're not running PSPs at all. So I can see that half of you have voted already. I'm just going to hold that open for 3 more seconds to get a few more votes in. So 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at what everybody says. Okay, thanks everybody. Got most of you there. So it's a bit of a normal distribution. I guess that we should be a little bit happy that the 2 largest categories are at the top, but only a quarter of people who would describe themselves as investing heavily in this area and at the more advanced level, with more than a third in the sort of category, down to sort of individual efforts. So I'm obviously interested in bringing this back to the panel again, but perhaps it'd be interesting for you to each also mention whereabouts you actually would sit on this spectrum as well, and what some of the frustrations and opportunities are to actually speed these things along, and of course where you think the greatest benefits actually lie in terms of what technology and opportunity to select. So back to the panel.
Yeah, hi, this is Dhairya. Actually, one of the biggest thing that being into the rare disease world, we have a really small patient population, but I think the PSP where it works, and then what I think Jim already mentioned is about getting more holistic is something that we are already working towards it, and it kind of helps us being into the rare disease area. We literally, from the time when we define our solution, such as the drug delivery device or any of those that goes with our drug, we now, and then it's a kind of a paradigm shift where we are actually putting our patient services and patient support program right in the center of it, so as the patient, and then try to see how all these technologies, how all these therapies can not only just help the patient, but trying to understand what could be the problems that patient would face in a patient journey and how to proactively solve it. And it's a kind of a paradigm shift to think about putting our shoes into the patient and then see how that disease state hinders the normal life cycle, and how we can actually put back to probably put the normal life and then quality of life back to the track with the therapies, and not only just therapies, providing the better services.
Yeah, Jim here. I mean, one of the comments I'd make is that so we've worked on these programs across a range of different conditions, and I think there's different characteristics depending on whether you're looking at a general medicine program or a specialty program or even a rare program, as Dhairya mentioned. I think what you're going to see is, just because of the size of the populations of patients in the general medicine area, that it'll primarily be technology-driven programs, because that's what's scalable on a large scale. And typically, patients in those populations often didn't have many services at all, but now you see lots of things like connected inhalers and various sort of devices that are starting to address those large conditions. In specialty, where there is traditionally some form of PSP that exists, I think the opportunity is to kind of meld digital and technology into those PSP programs, so that it becomes, it gets the benefit of both, actually, because you do need human contact as well as some of these technologies that can help. And I think in the rare area, as Dhairya mentioned, I think the opportunity really is around trying to help bring those complex patients closer to their care team and give them, in a sense, more access and more timely access, facilitated maybe through technology. So I think the flavors of patient support service are going to vary across the different type of therapy area.
Yeah, at Novartis, I think most people will be aware of the focus we have on data science, and digital is a big part of that shift. I think specific to patient support programs, we are exploring a lot of technologies that can be integrated into our patient support programs, making information far more accessible, but also creating a more personalized experience. And I think that last part, really a personalized experience, understanding a patient's individual context, what is the support and service level that they need, what is their current mental state, are they engaged with their health, are they disengaged, how active are they? I think all those things will influence the far more individual journey in a patient support program that we're going to try and create. And I think within that, I think we can do all that. The technology will allow it, but I think within that, the big challenge is really to make that as seamless as possible and not increase the burden on the patient to fill out more questionnaires, to do more assessments, and to deal with more technology that they may actually struggle to understand how to operate. So there's so many possibilities, but then the challenge is, how do you really create an experience that is still really seamless and feels easy for the patient and is simple to really understand?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Sandra. This is Doug with UCB, and we're very similar in thinking about how are we beginning to better understand the data, understanding the patient's interactions. I would believe another challenge as well is a cultural shift or a cultural change. How are we able to better act or interact with these smaller and more nimble organizations that are developing these technologies? How can we bring them in? How do we reset ourselves as an organization with respect to partnership versus owning and developing? And these are some of the questions that we commonly come across. There are pieces that we'd like to own, and there are pieces that as we look at them, by the time we develop them ourselves, the technology's already passed. And so it's also turning more into a nimble organization that is able to flex and move with respect to what's happening in the market and what's possible.
Yeah, that's a really important point. In that sense, I think there's a lot we can do really well because of our scale, our ability to reach customers, to reach patients. But certainly when it comes to the high, the real innovation of certain things around mental health, for instance, that are happening, digital therapeutics and digital coaching, there's amazing work being done in smaller environments, and we shouldn't try to take over that environment, because actually the way these companies have set themselves up is a great incubator for that type of innovation. It might be sometimes that we would never be able to recreate that.
Okay, thanks everybody. I just want to quickly bring in some audience comments. We've got a fair few questions here. Thank you very much for those who've been sending them in. Martel Campbell has sent a couple. He says, do you think that Pharma will be able to develop next generation PSPs by themselves, or will it necessitate innovation from third parties? And if so, what third parties do you think are best positioned to drive this evolution? Also, should Pharma be concerned with the perception of pill pushing when it comes to developing these next-gen patient support programs? Better medication adherence would mean more revenue for Pharma, so how should Pharma avoid the perception of being self-serving? Bruno Figueroa says, to what extent should we really focus to integrate patients and caretakers into the design, development, and implementation of these programs? I'm sure the answer to that will be a lot, but obviously some of the practicalities would be useful from each of you. Interested to hear the panel's views on the challenges created by the entry of biosimilars into specialty business and how that will impact the investment model for PSPs, how to differentiate with digital technologies within this setting. That was Gary Egan. Neil James says the need to design around patient needs is clear, but how does this trade off versus each pharmaco wanting to own the PSP? This is something that I've been talking about quite a lot recently. Obviously, most companies recognizing that providing their own individual solution is not very patient-centric, yet this is an area where very few people are actually making any progress at all. So what are we actually doing to actually work with our competitors on behalf of patients there? So there are a lot more coming in, so appreciate those. Do keep them rolling in. And by the way, a lot of people are asking about slides and recordings. Yes, we are recording today, and I will be sending that out to each and every one of you, so you don't need to ask me. And we'll send that over a couple of days after the session ends. So anyway, would any of the panel like to take on any of those questions that I've just read out?
This is Doug, Paul. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Doug.
Oh, no, so the one I was going to look at quickly is how do we engage patients and caregivers through the development. One of the things that we've looked at, and I think is going to be very important, it is a resounding yes, and we need to do more of it. But one of the areas we've looked at is that traditionally we go out to these populations, we engage them in the beginning, we go back to our shop, we build, and then we come back with a finished product. But in reality, if we think about the speed with which we're making decisions and how we need to be able to do it, is how can we frequently go back to those populations and ask them questions throughout the course of development, really taking more of an innovative approach instead of just build, 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 and reveal. It's more of a coming back. So we've really started to think about how do you build patient almost panels that you can use to go back and connect with and consistently ask questions so that you reach a point, you hit a key decision point, you go back, and then you continue to go back. But I think that will continue to be more and more of an important piece in how we are developing these solutions, because we cannot develop them obviously in a silo, and we have to rethink how we're engaging those populations as well.
Yeah, and also I think a cultural shift that not everything that we deliver needs to be at 100% perfect. I think that these programs and digital by nature can have a learning attitude, a learning nature in it. So I think we need to change our approach to how we gather our customer feedback within the programs themselves, but also really understand how people are using the different, let's say, pieces of information, the different services, and adapt as we go, because we often sort of have a, let's say, 2-year cycle of innovation or something like that, and I think we need to shift as much as we can towards maybe a 2-month cycle. Which is a big transformation, I think, for most pharma companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think what to address the question of third parties on the model, I think what we're seeing in the market is that there is actually an increasing willingness from pharma companies to, when they think about these types of services, and particularly the technology-enabled ones, that they don't necessarily need to own those services, and they don't necessarily feel like they need to own them. So, of course, they're interested in the service being available. They're interested in improving patients' experience. But there is a kind of a recognition that a way to do that might be through sponsoring them, but being a little bit at arm's length from them. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that I think that sometimes it might be easier when those services are provided not directly by pharma. I think the second is that in terms of management of the patient data, it can be, again, a better proposition if the data is managed by a third party, but the insights may come back to pharma in an anonymized fashion. And I think the third piece is that there's a lot of talk, obviously, about the innovation cycle and how do you build these products in a way that's meaningful and quick enough so that they don't get overrun by technology. But I think one of the other aspects is that even once you've built a technology, actually operationalizing it and managing it is another question. How does it evolve over time? How does it scale? How does it become localized in lots of countries? All of those kinds of challenges are ones that for technologies, pharma companies aren't necessarily best suited to deliver. So it can be that, again, third parties have a role to play in that. And I think what we're seeing is a kind of a more willingness, at least, to look at different models which don't involve, kind of owning, controlling, and managing those kind of services.
And I'd like to build upon that, which is one of the questions from the audiences regarding if pharma company can by itself build something like that. And the answer is yes and no both, because certainly pharma company has a really good knowledge about a particular disease state, or in a sense of having a really good knowledge about the focused areas. However, as I think one of the panelists mentioned, that there are comorbidities and there are other diseases. So we think patient or as a human, not as in just one disease state. So in those cases, definitely pharma company can build a really good patient services or patient support programs towards one disease. But I think it'll be a consortia that in a way comes together with a third party that can actually have this data regarding all those different disease states and what a patient needs are kind of more helpful when there is a a consortium of the pharma companies and third parties comes together to develop a program that is not only just addressing one disease state, but it actually goes for many and then kind of helps patient through a really nice database that is actually comes from different disease states and the other valuable pieces of the information around it.
You raise a very interesting point too, because I think one of the other questions was the perception of pharma of our industry playing in this space, and is it self-serving? Are we pill pushing?
Right.
But it's that part of the comorbidities and beginning to recognize that it is not just our disease, and recognizing the other challenges that will begin to shed that perception. However, that won't happen overnight. So we also need to be careful in playing in spaces where we are legitimate. And recognizing where we may not be legitimate, even if we have the capacity, the capability, and even the insights, finding the right third party that can help us to reach that population and do it in an effective manner will also be critical, certainly in these next couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And then also, because we did at the beginning of today's session talk about data, and I think that's the other side of it, that there's a big societal discussion around data privacy. And I think when we design our programs, we need to be really transparent about, as much as we can be, about why are we doing these things, what type of data do we need to actually enable certain services, what happens to that data. I mean, obviously the GDPR in Europe has a big role in that, the data privacy regulations, but I think also as a company or as companies, we need to take a new look at how we communicate with the users of our services and explain ourselves sometimes better. So that they truly understand what are they giving us, what are we giving back. You know, is this something that is only related to our brands, or is there actually value in our programs that is available to anyone who is suffering from a certain disease?
Okay, everybody. This is good conversation, and we are getting a lot more questions coming in. Please do send them through, and I will come back to reading a few more of those out in just a moment. I'm also getting a lot of questions about what specific digital services, what specific technologies are actually moving the needle most, what various things people are actually trying the most. And it turns out that I've got a very question on this for the audience. I think the wisdom of the crowd could help answer this one. So if you look at your screen right now, which next generation tools and products is your company integrating into PSPs? Obviously, if you work for a non-pharma company, then do talk about the PSPs that you've seen being implemented by pharma companies in order to answer this question. You can actually choose as many answers as you like on this one. Try not to pick every single one, though. Have a think and choose which one that you've really seen being integrated. So connected devices and sensors, that can include, of course, wearables of all forms, etc., IoT, digital therapeutics and digital medicines. Digital therapeutics obviously being standalone digital products that have been through some kind of clinical trial process and approval process. Digital medicine of the sort that Jim mentioned earlier, being run by companies like Proteus to enhance an existing medicine. Behavioral science, other psychological understanding, the use of real social understanding there to actually enhance your PSPs, or clinical decision support and sophisticated data analytics. I'm not talking about basic stuff here. I'm talking about the sort of thing that is robust enough to actually use potentially for access to payer understanding and use in real-world study situations. So which ones of those, or finally none of the above, of course, you might not be doing any of them. So very interested to see where you're going. I can see roughly half of you have voted again, clearly the awake, alert half of the audience. So let me see if I can wake the rest of you up and get the rest of you to fill that in. I'll give you 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much, everybody. Let's have a look at the results. Okay, so it's actually a relatively even spread, but with three clear winners and 2 clear slight losers here. So connected devices, behavioral science is probably the strongest, and clinical decision support, all registering over 40%, with roughly a quarter to a fifth of you choosing the digital therapeutics, or unfortunately none of the above for some of you as well. So you're in the minority there, those of you. I've just been asked by people how many respondents for these polls. Well, 800 people have signed up, and I think about a quarter of those people, I think I've got about just close to 250 people live right now listening to this, and that gives you an idea of how many people are answering these questions. Okay, so any comments from the panel? I think I'm going to specifically ask Jim to answer this one first, because you've got probably the broadest experience across multiple companies and digital and disease areas as to what you've actually seen create the greatest benefits in different forms. So, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yes, so for sure, I would say if we look at, say, connected devices, at the most basic level, programs around adherence obviously are very popular. There's a lot of them going on, and they are using connected devices where there's connected drug delivery devices, whether that be an auto injector, whether it be a connected inhaler, whether it be a continuous glucose monitor, or an insulin pump. So these kind of connected devices that can deliver therapy, report what has been delivered, and that you can build companion applications beside them, and having those as integrated then as part of patient support programs where you've got some level of clinical triage about them, around them. That's the most, I would say, in terms of what we've seen, they're the most popular types of programs at the moment. Behavioral science absolutely being increasingly used in terms of thinking about if you're going to provide interventions. You know, honestly, you don't want a bunch of technologists in a room sitting and thinking about what's the most useful intervention that can be provided. There is a science behind it, which is around understanding how humans make decisions and building that into your program. We're seeing that absolutely increasingly. Clinical decision support, again, absolutely. If you're going to try and connect this type of data back into a patient support program, you got to make it really easy for clinicians to act on it in an efficient way. You got to highlight the cases that are going to be important to prioritize, and you got to provide some decision support around risk analysis and other things that's going to be useful for clinicians who are part of the service. So I fully agree actually with the order and the kind of percentage voting that's there, and I'd also agree that things like digital therapeutics, which for sure I think are going to be very important. I think we're just kind of at the start of them being included in programs. We have seen them included in a few, particularly around treating conditions like depression, maybe as a comorbidity with another chronic condition.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So to the rest of you, obviously, I know, Derry, you've got a lot of experience in the IoT and device world, so I'm sure you have something to say here, but very interested in everybody's opinions.
No, absolutely. So I think one of the really great piece that comes with the connected medical devices or the sensors are it's on the patient, it's actually collecting the data. But for that, patient doesn't need to actively push some buttons and stuff like that, which helps in a way that, as someone just alluded, that the whole purpose of collecting data is to understand more about patient and how we can help more, and not to keep on reminding them about their disease state and whether they are ill or something like that. Obviously, as a pharma company, we would also like to lead our patient a normal life. So in those senses, the connected devices kind of bridges that gap where it is there for delivering the medication, but on the other end, it can collect a pretty good amount of data that could be used for any patient support programs that will help with the future services and other information.
Okay, and just while you're here, Daria, I'm getting there's a question here. How do you actually deal with combination therapies? Because most PSPs, of course, are only single disease centric. I'm not entirely sure what deal with exactly means from the questioner, but maybe you can give us a little bit of color.
Oh, definitely. I completely get that question. So it's certainly it's for one disease. I completely understand. However, the data for that one disease is very accurate. Mixed with the comorbidity and the other data, certainly you can get a really enriched information about that patient, particularly or patient population as a whole. And in those cases, as I alluded before, more like in consortia of the pharmaceutical companies, third parties, they can certainly build, based on those information, the patient services programs that can really address the needs of the patient. So,
okay. Sandra or Doug, do you have any comments? I'll just share the results on the screen once again about these results. And also, maybe you could also answer in the course of a question here from Per, any thoughts on what method or technique is actually most beneficial for boosting adherence the most? Anything that can push beyond 50% adherence over time, and any examples obviously would be much appreciated.
Right, so maybe I'll kick it off. I mean, we are exploring all of these. I mean, they are not all fully integrated into PSPs, but they're all being worked on. I think one that I'm missing here, which we are also actively working on, is chatbots and artificial intelligence supporting chatbots, which I think from a customer engagement perspective is quite important, because it can actually mean that we can maintain more data integrity and use data more intelligently within the customer experience. I think, sorry, can you repeat the follow-up question?
Yes, the follow-up question was what would actually be the most beneficial for adherence rates, effectively?
Right, and I think that's where the behavioral science and also really understanding the attitudes that drive the behavior are coming in. So one of the things we are looking at also is really getting better at really assessing individual patients, understanding their communication and learning preferences, understanding their level of engagement, how it fluctuates over time, and understanding their level of what we call activation. So how actively are they playing a role in their general health and also specifically to their disease. And for people who are interested in that area, there's something called the patient activation measure, which could be interesting to look at for people. It's one of the things that we're looking at as well.
Yeah, building off, Sandra, what you were talking about for UCB, we're looking at actually the 4 plus the 5th one you mentioned with respect to AI and chatbots. So we're looking at all of these different areas. They're not necessarily all connected to PSPs, but we are trying to understand how to better work in these spaces and how they'll benefit our patient populations. Moving with respect to engagement, it is, I would have to agree, it's the purple bar. It's behavioral science and psychological understanding, patient activation. What we've started to look at is traditionally we looked at the patient journey through a clinical lens and trying to understand how they were interacting with the healthcare ecosystem. But in reality, it's the social determinants that swim around that and what happens in between those visits that have a critical piece to play with respect to adherence and even persistency as we begin to look across some of these chronic illnesses and recognize the decisions that folks are making as to why they're not adherent. A lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, it's not forgetfulness. There are other factors that are driving these decisions, and that's what you need to be able to pull apart and understand.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most important things to walk away with when it comes to the changing behavior, is that the most important moments are happening outside of the health clinic, and we need to understand those much better from a behavioral and attitudinal perspective. Historically, our understanding has much more focused on patients journeying through the healthcare system, but that is actually for a chronic disease is not really in the long run what the most important factor is.
I've got a couple of, sorry to interrupt, guys. I just want to I'm aware that we've not got a huge amount of time left. I just want to make sure we're also including a couple of other audience questions here. Feel free to answer what you were just about to say. I think I interrupted you, Jim. But also a couple of questions. How are regulators, and I'm going to add, how are payers starting to view these next generation PSPs? Which aspects of these new technologies, etc., are being actually useful for these audiences, and are there prospects that clinical trials in the future could even include strong PSP elements going forward in order to ensure that they're part of the regulatory and payer system? Where do you think the best place for patient payer support programs is to sit within the pharma organization? So who should be responsible? Should it be brand level, or should it be above brand level somehow? Do we actually need to pursue organizational reform in order to make sure that PSPs can actually be created as they should be? And then finally, a question on digital therapeutics. Do you think that digital therapeutics companies should build out their own PSPs and compete more directly with established players? Or do you think that existing pharma companies should include those digital therapeutics as a core part of PSPs and have them as a complementary product? So 3 interesting questions there that perhaps you might want to touch on as well.
Okay, so maybe I'll jump in. I'll just make one comment on one of the previous questions, and I think it relates also to the set of questions that came up there. So again, back to the behavioral science side of it, there is someone asked about adherence and the effectiveness, what effective approaches there are. So for sure, there are behavioral models like COM-B, like PAPA, which are models that are specifically designed to focus on improving adherence, and they can be incorporated into programs and delivered via technology. But, back to the point that was made earlier, which is that actually around patients' goal isn't to be adherent, right? So that's not the way they're thinking. So you have to provide value to them in general, and that means that it's not one single shot thing that you do that, is going to help patients be adherent. It's actually coordinating a set of actions via therapy management platform that is going to deliver value to patients that's personalized to them is actually the kind of key piece, so that you're delivering value, they perceive value from engaging in the service, and as a result of that, they actually become more adherent to their therapy. So it's kind of that approach, I think, is the way that we would certainly think about it.
Thank you. Does anyone want to take any of the other questions as well?
Yeah, I'll take the question on digital therapeutics, and in some ways it's a yes and no, in the sense that I think there's quality within larger pharmaceutical companies of building digital therapeutics to the next level. In some cases, it really does depend on the disease area and the type of digital therapeutic that we're talking about. So I actually think it can be a really healthy collaboration between smaller, innovative, more startup-style companies working closely together with larger pharmaceutical companies that maybe have that disease area expertise, that have a good access to the customer networks, and have a long heritage in a disease area. So obviously competition can always take place, but I think in many cases you'll find that there may actually be a really good collaboration happening, which also for the physicians and patients may actually be the best scenario.
So one thing to build on that, though, we're talking about value and where these programs are being developed, and one of the questions addressed regulators and payers' view. From a payer perspective, when we think about some of these patient support services, what we're also seeing is in many cases they're beginning to develop some of these programs, because ultimately, certainly in the US, it's a little bit more of an arms race between the payers as to what are the services that I can provide that will make me more attractive to the patient population so that I can increase my size. And then I think the other side of it as well is how am I better able to manage that patient population and manage the cost and deliver additional value. So we can even see that in many cases, depending upon the level of the program, we may even come across payers that that could ultimately become competitors in some of these places as well.
Okay, excellent.
Just to build upon that, it's a very realistic scenario, because what Doug just said is we've been seeing payers getting more and more interested in getting the patient data and how and what happens to those patient journeys, and how the patient is getting served based on all this data. So, and I think that's one of the reasons for the outcome-based reimbursement and those. So it's one of those very realistic arms race where it could be payers, or it could be the pharma companies, or it could be someone else who can build this type of programs to move forward with.
Okay, we haven't got very long left, about 4 or 5 minutes. What I want to do is to see if I can squeeze in a couple more audience questions. I think it's quite interesting to see the results, even if we're not going to have a huge amount of time to talk about them. Let's have a quick look at your screens now. This is a question a bit more about your future ambitions. So how far does your ambition extend with your PSPs? Firstly, they will be one of the primary essential ways to support programs. In other words, they are utterly core to our future development. They are a significant way to make medicine more holistic, so they might not be the primary activity, but they're certainly a key. You prefer to support third parties to deliver holistically for patients, so the majority of your investment perhaps going into being a good partner as opposed to necessarily delivering on everything. And then finally, they're a distraction from the core distribution and access models that pharma has obviously traditionally focused on. So which one of those would you like to choose? I can see the votes coming in right now, so I'll hold that open for another few seconds, and hopefully we get all your responses in. I've got about 40–45% of you in. Come on, everyone, let's go. 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you, everybody. Let's have a look at the result. Okay, so most people saying, well, either essential or a significant way, and a small 4% of people who clearly haven't been persuaded by any of the comments that have been made today and believe that it's absolutely a distraction. So perhaps no surprises there. Obviously, we've got an audience here that's going to be slightly biased towards that. Rather than necessarily talking about that, I'm just going to ask one more of these questions. And because I'd like to see what you guys actually believe to be the biggest benefit to making these kind of investments. So again, which one of these would you choose? Is it better business models, high revenues, faster growth? In other words, it's going to help our commercial performance in the long term. That's the primary reason. That's the reason why we can invest. Is it going to be because we can create better data, better RWE for use elsewhere, for example, in creating access with our medicines, or obviously useful to our sales and marketing departments? Thirdly, delivering on value or outcomes-based contracts, obviously not something that's mainstream at the moment, but it's perhaps an inevitability that they will be more commonplace, and particularly as PSPs get more sophisticated, more realistic as well. So is that the key? Fourth thing, because it's better for patients, quite simply, and that is the absolute and pure reason why they should be done. Although finally, keeping that traditional doctor-patient, doctor-pharma relationship and doctor-patient relationship intact, is it going to give us stronger buy-in and partnerships with the HCPs? So yes, I can see several people saying, I wish I could choose more than one answer. I am particularly evil here in making you choose only one, but it is supposed to be the biggest benefit, so I am forcing you to choose, I realize. So I'll hold that open another 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Lovely. Okay, here we go. Well, we have a very lovely audience with us here today because they have chosen nearly 50% because it's better for patients. There is the fourth option, and then it's pretty even on the other responses, actually. So very interesting there. We've got a few more audience questions coming in now in the last few minutes. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to every single one of these, but I will come to perhaps, what time is it? We've got only got a minute or two left. What I'd like to do is to just have the panel just give us a very quick sentence each, and I'm afraid I can't give you much more than a sentence each in summarizing what you think has been the key learning, or what message you would wish for people to leave home with most of all, based on either these poll results or indeed on the conversation earlier. So let's go through one by one, perhaps in the order on the screen. So Jim, have you got something you'd like to say?
I suppose just very quickly, I think it is an enormous opportunity, and I'm very encouraged by the poll results because it shows that there's actually quite a lot of activity going on in terms of people thinking about or creating these services and using these types of new technologies that are available.
Great, thank you. Sander?
So yeah, for me, I feel strengthened from the discussion in my belief that most of health is happening in someone's house and home setting, and I think these new technologies can really create seamless experiences for patients, not only in the health clinic but also at home, which I think is where we can reach the biggest benefits.
Excellent, thank you, Doug.
No, I would agree. I'm excited by the conversation we've had today, and just really, in general, the opportunity we have as an industry to really transition from thinking about the patient to really beginning to think like the patient and the value that will deliver.
And Daria?
Hi, I'm actually really amazed with the how different perspective and everything we are and the background that we all are coming from the different companies as well as the different functions, pharmas, and etc. But how how like-minded we all are going for the next generation of the PSP, and that is what amazes me with this discussion.
Okay, well, thank you. And I'm going to finish with a final comment from the audience. Per Settenberg's final comment, actually, he says, better for patients means, of course, better for everyone in the value chain, drugs, patient, doctor, payer, pharma, and absolutely should therefore be the focus. So a nice word to end on there. Thank you so much to each of you for taking part in today's session and contributing with your ideas, your energy, and your very inquisitive minds. I've already got a few thank you messages coming in from the audience. Appreciate those. Could you also, as well as saying thank you, which obviously is much appreciated, let us know what it is that you think that we should be doing next, or what particular areas you wish we'd focused on, and what you, if you've got any final questions that you'd love to see, perhaps if anyone from the panel could answer post-webinar. And while you do that, I'd just like to make you aware that if you enjoyed this discussion, you can actually continue with this discussion. We've got an event happening in Europe and an event happening in the US very soon. Both of them, as you can see, in October, a week apart, one in London, one in Philadelphia, and indeed some of the same faces and conversations that we've been having today are going to be had in a far more in-depth way over a period of a couple of days. So really looking forward to seeing some of you actually at that session and meeting you face-to-face with myself. So both from myself and my colleague Anza, who is sitting just next to me in the room here in London, really appreciate your time. Once again, a massive thank you to the panelists and of course, for getting this far. We're even going to give you a special discount if you indeed do want to attend either of those events. You can type that code in, save it, and get a €200 discount. So, you know, probably worth your time, I hope, if you are indeed hoping to see us in person. Really appreciate it. I'm going to hold the webinar open for a couple more minutes, as I can see a few of you are typing in your comments and ideas, and I want to encourage you to do that. Otherwise, thank you from me. Once again, a huge thank you to S3 and Jim for their assistance in making today happen and getting it all organized and having obviously such a fruitful discussion. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Really enjoyed it, and I'm sure we will see and talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.